History often feels like a long, winding story in which the same chapters return under slightly different titles. Wars erupt, empires expand and fall, economies rise and collapse, societies flourish and fracture. Generations pass, technologies evolve, but certain patterns remain strikingly familiar. The question naturally arises, why does humanity, despite remarkable progress in knowledge, technology, and social organization, continue to find itself entangled in crises that echo the struggles of the past? This phenomenon of historical repetition is both a puzzle and a warning, challenging the assumption that forward motion automatically equates to liberation from old mistakes. At first glance, it might seem that every war is unique, every revolution tied to its particular time and place, every collapse of power driven by its own peculiar mix of circumstances. Yet the deeper we look into historical records, the more we notice how often events mirror one another. The fall of the Roman Empire, the decline of the Ming dynasty, the weakening of European colonial powers in the 20th century, each story unfolds differently in its details, but the arcs appear familiar. Civilizations rise through innovation and unity, expand through conquest or trade, then face internal divisions, economic strains, and external pressures that eventually weaken them. Similarly, economic crises recur in waves. Markets grow exuberant, bubbles form, warnings are ignored, the crash comes, and societies scramble to recover, only to repeat the cycle with different assets, different currencies, and different players a few decades later. Revolutions, too, follow comparable scripts. A ruling order becomes disconnected from the needs of its people, resentment grows, intellectual movements articulate new visions, and uprisings sweep through. Whether in 18th century France, early 20th century Russia, or in more recent political upheavals, the broad rhythm of discontent, protest, revolution, and consolidation reappears. Even global crises such as pandemics or environmental stresses echo through time. The Black Death in medieval Europe, the Spanish flu in the early 20th century, and the COVID-19 pandemic of the 21st century demonstrate not only humanity's vulnerability to disease but also the recurring social, political, and economic disruption such crises unleash. This sense of repetition has long captured the imagination of historians, philosophers, and ordinary observers alike. Some describe history as cyclical, unfolding in loops rather than straight lines. Others prefer the metaphor of spirals, where events never return to exactly the same place but instead revisit familiar territory on a new level. Still others argue that history progresses in waves, with alternating periods of stability and upheaval. Regardless of the chosen image, the recognition that patterns emerge across centuries is undeniable. It invites a scientific question: are these repetitions merely coincidences, or do they point to deeper structures that govern human behavior and social organization? The importance of this question cannot be overstated. If history is nothing more than a collection of unique episodes, then studying the past may offer wisdom or inspiration but little predictive power. If, however, there are scientific foundations to the repetition of historical scenarios, then history becomes not only a repository of stories but also a field of patterns, cycles, and dynamics that can be analyzed, compared, and perhaps even anticipated. Such a perspective shifts history closer to the realm of natural sciences, where patterns are expected, theories are tested, and predictions are possible, even if never perfectly accurate. Recognizing repetition also challenges our modern confidence in progress. The notion that new technologies, better education, and more sophisticated institutions will permanently shield us from the errors of earlier eras is comforting but misleading. Progress changes the context in which human societies act, but it does not erase the fundamental drivers of conflict, competition, and cooperation. Human psychology, biological instincts, the structure of economies, the dynamics of political power, and the pressures of environment and resources remain remarkably consistent. As long as these forces persist, the likelihood of recurring scenarios remains high. At the same time, the scientific study of repetition in history does not reduce human experience to mechanical determinism. It is not that people are condemned to repeat the past in precisely the same way, but rather that underlying conditions tend to recreate familiar patterns of tension and resolution. Each generation faces its own circumstances, yet the range of possible outcomes is shaped by universal dynamics. In this sense, repetition in history is both a constraint and an opportunity. By recognizing the scientific foundations of these patterns, societies can become more aware of the traps that await them and more deliberate in their choices. The introduction of this perspective prepares us for a deeper exploration. The phenomenon of historical repetition is not an illusion, nor is it a mere matter of careless memory. It is grounded in the psychology of individuals, the biology of human beings, the dynamics of large groups, the structures of economies and political systems, the limits imposed by the natural environment, and the non-linear behavior of complex systems. It has been studied by historians, economists, sociologists, and scientists who attempt to model human societies with the same rigor used to study ecosystems or weather patterns. The fact that history seems to repeat itself, therefore, is not simply a quirk of storytelling or nostalgia. It reflects the persistent forces that govern how humans act and interact across time. This realization provides a starting point. To understand why history repeats itself is to accept that progress does not erase vulnerability, that human nature remains constant amid changing circumstances, and that societies are subject to rhythms and cycles beyond their immediate control. From here, the task is to examine each of these forces more closely and to trace how, together, they produce the remarkable continuity of human experience across centuries. History is often thought of as a collection of stories, a chronicle of kings and queens, wars and treaties, inventions and disasters. Yet when it is approached as a science, history becomes more than storytelling. It becomes a discipline that seeks to understand not only what happened but also why it happened, how events are connected, and whether the patterns we observe have explanatory value. Defining history as a discipline means recognizing that it operates with its own methods, principles, and frameworks, even though it does not always resemble the laboratory sciences. Historians collect evidence, analyze sources, test interpretations, and debate the reliability of narratives, all in an effort to construct accounts that go beyond memory or myth. At its core, history is both an inquiry into the past and an effort to uncover the forces that shape human societies over time. A central challenge in treating history as a science lies in balancing the uniqueness of events with the search for regularities. On one hand, every moment in history arises from a particular constellation of people, places, and circumstances. The French Revolution was not identical to the Russian Revolution, just as the Great Depression of the 20th century was not the same as the financial crisis of 2008. Each was shaped by its cultural context, its leaders, its technologies, and its timing. On the other hand, historians and social scientists cannot ignore the striking similarities between these episodes. Revolutions often follow arcs of mounting discontent, mobilization, violence, and eventual reorganization of power. Economic collapses tend to unfold in recognizable phases of expansion, overconfidence, breakdown, and recovery. To deny these patterns would be to overlook one of the most powerful insights history can provide. This tension between the uniqueness of events and the recurrence of patterns has animated debates in the philosophy of history for centuries. Some thinkers, particularly in the 19th century, argued that history is fundamentally linear, a steady march of progress or decline, with each event unrepeatable and singular. Others, influenced by ancient traditions as well as modern sociology, proposed that history is cyclical, governed by rhythms of rise and fall, growth and decay, much like the natural world. The idea that civilizations are born, mature, and eventually collapse has appeared in the works of philosophers from Polybius to Oswald Spengler. Such frameworks invite us to think of history not as a random sequence of accidents but as a field structured by laws, tendencies, and recurring dynamics. When history is studied as a science, the search for these dynamics becomes crucial. Historians collect data not only in the form of documents, artifacts, and testimonies but also through quantitative measures, census records, economic statistics, military expenditures, climate data. By comparing societies across time and space, scholars can test hypotheses about why empires expand, why revolutions occur, or why economies collapse. For example, climatricians, historians who use statistical and economic models, have argued that certain economic pressures reliably produce social unrest. Likewise, cliodynamics, a more recent field, uses mathematical modeling to track long-term cycles of political stability and instability. The aim is not to reduce history to a mechanistic formula but to identify recurring conditions under which certain outcomes are more likely. The recognition of historical cycles is one of the most provocative outcomes of this scientific approach. A cycle, in this context, does not mean an exact repetition, as if the same play were performed over and over with different actors. Rather, it means that the same types of pressures tend to recur, producing broadly similar outcomes. The growth of population, for instance, often places strain on resources, leading to economic inequality, which in turn fuels political discontent and upheaval. This process might take centuries in one case and decades in another, but the rhythm of tension and release appears with remarkable regularity. Theories of economic cycles, such as those proposed by Nikolai Kondratiev or Joseph Schumpeter, emphasize long waves of growth and contraction that shape the fortunes of nations. Theories of political cycles describe the turnover of elites, the rise and fall of ruling classes, and the oscillation between stability and chaos. To approach history as a science, then, is to accept that it can be studied with the same seriousness as natural phenomena, even if its subject matter is human rather than physical. Unlike physics or chemistry, history cannot isolate variables in a laboratory. Its experiments are the lived experiences of entire societies, unfolding over decades and centuries. Yet the absence of controlled conditions does not mean the absence of order. Just as meteorologists cannot control the weather but can nonetheless discern patterns and make forecasts, so historians and social scientists can recognize the dynamics that give rise to recurring events. In both cases, uncertainty remains, but uncertainty does not preclude knowledge. There is also a philosophical dimension to this scientific approach. If history contains recurring cycles, then the past is not merely a museum of bygone eras but a guide to the future. The study of earlier civilizations offers warnings about the fragility of power, the dangers of unchecked inequality, and the inevitability of change. At the same time, it raises questions about human agency. If cycles are so strong, how much freedom do individuals or societies really have to alter their trajectory? The very act of identifying cycles is a call to reflection. Are we trapped in them, or can awareness allow us to intervene and redirect their course? The scientific study of history does not diminish the richness of individual events, rather, it situates them within broader contexts. The uniqueness of a revolution, a war, or a cultural movement can coexist with the recognition that similar conditions often give rise to similar results. Just as no two storms are identical yet all storms share recognizable dynamics, no two historical episodes are the same yet many display repeating features. By embracing this dual perspective, history as a discipline moves beyond storytelling and into analysis, offering tools to understand the past and, potentially, to anticipate the future. The notion of historical cycles thus emerges not as a metaphor but as a working hypothesis grounded in evidence. It suggests that while history may never repeat itself in perfect detail, it often rhymes, as the forces that shape human societies are enduring and deeply rooted. This realization lays the foundation for a deeper inquiry into those forces, psychological, biological, social, economic, political, and environmental, that together weave the repeating patterns of human history. At the heart of the repetition we observe in history lies the nature of the human mind. Human beings are creatures of thought and emotion, but the very faculties that allow us to build societies, create technologies, and imagine the future also impose limits that channel us toward recurring mistakes. When history is examined through the lens of psychology, it becomes clear that many of the cycles of rise and fall, growth and collapse, war and peace are deeply connected to the way our minds perceive reality, respond to stress, and interact with one another in groups. Far from being purely rational actors, people are bound by cognitive biases, emotional impulses, and deep-seated drives that produce patterns of behavior echoing across centuries. One of the central limitations of human psychology is the structure of our cognitive models. We perceive the world through mental shortcuts, heuristics that simplify complex realities into manageable pieces. This capacity to generalize and filter information is necessary for survival, but it also distorts judgment. We tend to see patterns where none exist, to overestimate our ability to predict outcomes, and to cling to beliefs that confirm what we already think. These biases, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, optimism bias, are not modern inventions, they are part of the basic architecture of the human brain. When whole societies are shaped by these cognitive tendencies, the result is predictable cycles of overconfidence, miscalculation, and disillusionment. Leaders believe wars will be short and victorious, investors convince themselves that markets will rise forever, citizens imagine that revolutions will bring immediate justice. Time and again, reality intrudes, and the same cycle of misplaced expectations and painful corrections unfolds. Fear is perhaps the most primal and enduring of the forces shaping historical repetition. It governs individual behavior but becomes especially powerful in collective settings. Fear of scarcity drives communities into conflict over resources. Fear of the outsider creates waves of suspicion, persecution, and violence. Fear of losing status pushes ruling classes to tighten their grip on power. In markets, fear spreads contagiously, triggering panics where rational analysis vanishes and crowds rush to sell assets simply because others are doing the same. The collapses of stock exchanges in 1929 or 2008 illustrate how fear, magnified through group psychology, can bring entire economies to their knees. In politics, fear often manifests in mass hysteria, witch hunts, and authoritarian surges. Time and again, societies caught in the grip of fear repeat patterns of exclusion, repression, and aggression that earlier generations also endured. Opposite yet equally enduring is the force of greed. The desire to accumulate wealth, power, and influence is not unique to any culture or time period but a constant feature of human behavior. Greed drives innovation and ambition but also corruption, exploitation, and imbalance. Periods of economic prosperity often generate cycles of excess in which greed blinds individuals and institutions to looming risks. The speculative bubbles that preceded the Dutch tulip mania in the 17th century, the railway mania in 19th century Britain, or the housing bubble in the early 21st century all followed similar arcs: unchecked optimism, escalating investments, willful ignorance of danger, and eventual collapse. These episodes reveal how greed, when amplified by collective psychology, ensures that even sophisticated societies repeat mistakes known from centuries earlier. Another recurring psychological force is the pursuit of power. Human beings are hierarchical creatures, inclined to organize themselves into structures of authority. The drive to dominate or to lead is an ancient instinct tied to survival and reproduction. Across history, individuals with exceptional charisma or cunning have risen to power, often leading societies into triumphs or disasters that echo through generations. The presence of charismatic leaders, whether emperors, generals, or politicians, illustrates how collective psychology amplifies individual ambition. Masses frequently invest their hopes in such figures, attributing to them almost supernatural abilities to solve crises or deliver justice. This dynamic explains the repeated emergence of authoritarian regimes or populist movements, in which the longing for strong leadership overrides caution and critical thought. Figures as different as Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Adolf Hitler reflect a psychological pattern in which societies, weary of disorder or humiliation, surrender to the promise of decisive authority, often with catastrophic consequences. What unites these patterns, fear, greed, and the pursuit of power, is the way they interact with the limits of cognition to create cycles of repetition. People remember the broad outlines of disasters yet convince themselves that this time is different. Investors acknowledge past crashes but believe their era has new safeguards. Citizens recall the failures of past dictatorships but imagine that a new leader will break the cycle. This selective memory, rooted in cognitive bias, ensures that history does not simply move forward but circles back upon itself. Each generation confronts similar choices, and each generation tends to overestimate its ability to escape the pitfalls that ensnared its predecessors. Examples abound across history. Market panics demonstrate how quickly rational calculation can be overwhelmed by herd psychology. The South Sea Bubble in 18th century England showed investors piling into speculative ventures without understanding them, only to watch fortunes vanish overnight. Centuries later, the dot-com bubble repeated the pattern with digital companies, fueled by the same psychological mixture of greed, optimism, and herd behavior. In politics, the cycle of charismatic leaders continues to reappear. Alexander the Great inspired loyalty and fear through charisma and conquest, establishing a model repeated by later figures who promised glory or salvation. In modern democracies, the same psychological forces manifest in populist movements, where individuals rally around leaders who project confidence, strength, and simplicity in times of uncertainty. These examples reveal that history's repetitions are not the product of ignorance alone but of deep-seated psychological traits. Human beings cannot easily escape fear, greed, or the longing for authority, and these forces are not flaws to be eradicated but aspects of human nature to be understood. Recognizing their role in shaping cycles does not mean denying human agency but rather situating it within the constraints of psychology. Awareness of these limits can, in theory, help societies build safeguards against repetition, but awareness itself is not always enough. The same forces that drive repetition also resist self-correction. Thus, when viewed through the lens of psychology, the recurrence of historical scenarios becomes less mysterious. It is not that societies forget the past but that the basic architecture of the human mind continually regenerates the same dynamics under new circumstances. Fear will always surge in moments of crisis, greed will always tempt in moments of growth, and the pursuit of power will always entice leaders and followers alike. These traits, amplified by the limits of human cognition and the contagion of group behavior, ensure that history does not march in a straight line but bends into recurring arcs. In this sense, history is not just a record of external events but a mirror of the enduring psychological forces that shape humanity. Human history cannot be understood without reference to the biological and evolutionary foundations of behavior. Long before the rise of cities, governments, and economies, human beings were shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressures that mold the brain, instincts, and social patterns. These ancient influences have not disappeared in the modern world. They continue to exert a powerful force on how societies form, how they compete, and why they sometimes collapse. The human brain, for all its complexity, is not infinitely adaptable. It carries within it layers of instinct and predisposition that repeatedly resurface in historical contexts, driving cycles of aggression, competition, cooperation, and decline. The human brain evolved in conditions vastly different from those of modern civilization. For most of human history, survival depended on small-scale cooperation within tribes and constant vigilance against threats from outside groups or the natural environment. This evolutionary background left a legacy of instincts oriented toward immediate survival, suspicion of outsiders, strong in-group loyalty, rapid responses to danger, and a preference for short-term gains over long-term planning. These instincts made sense in an environment of scarcity and unpredictability, but in the context of large and complex societies, they often generate tensions that reproduce historical patterns of conflict and mistrust. Wars between nations, persecutions of minorities, and waves of xenophobia can all be traced, in part, to this ancient predisposition toward dividing the world into us and them. Aggression is another trait deeply rooted in biology and repeatedly visible in the course of history. While human beings are capable of extraordinary acts of empathy and cooperation, they are also capable of violence that exceeds immediate necessity. Evolutionary psychology suggests that aggression once provided advantages in securing territory, protecting resources, and establishing dominance. These impulses, magnified by group dynamics and modern technologies, fuel wars and political conflicts that mirror those of earlier times. The Trojan War, the Mongol invasions, the world wars of the 20th century, despite vast differences in context, they all reveal how aggression as a biological impulse can be amplified into systemic conflict. Even when societies create institutions to regulate violence, the underlying drive never disappears. It re-emerges when states feel threatened, when resources grow scarce, or when leaders exploit fear and anger to rally support. Competition for resources is perhaps the most universal driver of human conflict and repetition in history. Biological survival has always depended on access to food, water, shelter, and, in later stages, to wealth and energy. The expansion of empires was often justified in cultural or religious terms, but beneath these narratives lay the fundamental drive to secure resources. Rome sought grain from Egypt, Britain sought cotton and spices from its colonies, and modern powers vie for oil, rare earth minerals, and technological dominance. Each cycle of expansion and rivalry reflects the continuity of biological imperatives. As populations grow and consumption increases, competition intensifies, and societies repeat familiar struggles over land, trade routes, and resources, regardless of technological progress or political sophistication. Biology also constrains the ways in which social systems can function. Human beings are not blank slates who can be molded into any form of organization. Instead, our institutions must contend with the predispositions of the human brain, tendencies toward hierarchy, the need for belonging, and the difficulty of sustaining cooperation at large scales. Anthropological studies show that small groups naturally organize into hierarchies with leaders, allies, and rivals, a pattern that scales upward into tribes, kingdoms, and nation-states. Efforts to abolish hierarchy entirely, whether in utopian experiments or radical revolutions, often collapse under the weight of these biological inclinations, giving rise instead to new structures of power that resemble the old ones. Thus, even when societies attempt to break from past patterns, biology nudges them back toward familiar arrangements. Another constraint arises from the mismatch between the scale of modern societies and the capacities of the human brain. Cognitive scientists suggest that humans are naturally adapted to social groups of about 1 or 200 individuals, a scale at which personal relationships and trust can be maintained directly. Modern nations, however, number in the millions or billions, far beyond this natural limit. To cope, societies invent institutions, laws, religions, and ideologies that extend trust beyond immediate circles. Yet these constructs are fragile, and under stress people often retreat to smaller, more manageable identities, ethnic groups, religious communities, political factions. This retreat fuels cycles of fragmentation and conflict, as large-scale cooperation gives way to tribalism. The recurrence of civil wars, secessions, and factional disputes across history reflects this enduring biological constraint. The rhythms of population growth also reveal the imprint of biology on historical cycles. Human reproduction, influenced by biological drives and social norms, leads to periods of rapid population increase that strain resources, create inequality, and spark conflict. Historians such as Thomas Malthus argued that societies inevitably encounter limits when population outpaces food supply. While technological advances have postponed some of these crises, the underlying dynamic persists. Population pressure has been linked to peasant uprisings, migrations, and revolutions throughout history. In this sense, biology not only shapes individual behavior but also drives large-scale social transformations that repeat across eras. Even the experience of leadership and followership is rooted in biology. Studies in evolutionary psychology suggest that humans are predisposed to seek strong leaders in times of uncertainty, a trait that ensured survival in dangerous environments but also makes societies vulnerable to authoritarianism. The rise of charismatic rulers, from ancient conquerors to modern dictators, reflects this instinctive readiness to rally around figures who project dominance and confidence. History's repeated flirtation with autocracy, despite its often destructive outcomes, cannot be fully explained without acknowledging this biological dimension. In sum, the repetition of history is inseparable from the evolutionary legacy embedded in the human brain and body. Aggression, competition for resources, the inclination toward hierarchy, the limits of social cognition, all of these traits, shaped over millennia, continue to constrain the possibilities of human societies. While culture, technology, and institutions can channel or mitigate these forces, they cannot erase them. This is why progress in knowledge and innovation does not automatically free humanity from cycles of conflict and collapse. The same instincts that helped our ancestors survive on the savannah still shape decisions in parliaments, markets, and battlefields. To understand why history repeats itself, we must recognize that beneath the complexity of civilization lies the continuity of biology, a foundation that anchors human behavior across time. Human beings rarely act in isolation. While individuals may hold private beliefs or make personal decisions, much of history unfolds through the dynamics of groups, families, communities, nations, and movements that bring people together into collective patterns of behavior. Once individuals are embedded in groups, their psychology shifts, and the outcomes often become surprisingly predictable. This is the domain of sociology, the study of how people behave in social contexts, and it offers some of the clearest explanations for why history repeats itself. The forces that govern crowds and movements transcend time and place, ensuring that certain collective patterns emerge again and again. The behavior of the crowd has fascinated thinkers for centuries. Gustave Le Bon, in his classic work on crowd psychology, argued that individuals in groups often lose their sense of personal responsibility and rationality, becoming swept up in emotions that would not dominate them in isolation. In crowds, fear, anger, or enthusiasm spread like contagions, and reason gives way to instinct. Modern psychology and sociology have confirmed many of these insights, showing that collective behavior is shaped by mechanisms such as conformity, social proof, and emotional contagion. When large numbers of people gather, they become more alike, more easily influenced, and more inclined to act in unison. This explains why protests can escalate into revolutions, why markets swing between euphoria and panic, and why religious or political movements sometimes surge seemingly out of nowhere. The predictability of group behavior arises from these very dynamics. While individual choices may appear erratic, the behavior of large groups follows patterns that can be studied, modeled, and, to some extent, anticipated. Social movements, for example, often emerge when three conditions align: widespread discontent, a unifying ideology or narrative, and an opportunity for mobilization. Whether in the labor movements of the 19th century, the civil rights struggles of the 20th, or the digital activism of the 21st, these structural conditions recur. Once movements begin, they often follow familiar phases: initial organization, rapid growth as momentum builds, confrontation with established power, fragmentation as factions emerge, and either consolidation or decline. The specific details may vary, but the rhythm is remarkably consistent across cultures and eras. This predictability also extends to the way societies manage crises. In moments of fear or uncertainty, people often gravitate toward consensus, rallying behind strong leaders or simplified messages. In times of prosperity, societies tolerate more diversity of opinion and experimentation. These shifts produce oscillations between periods of conformity and periods of pluralism, which recur across history. The pendulum swings back and forth, not because of any deliberate choice, but because group dynamics push in that direction. Human beings find comfort in unity during times of danger, yet they also crave freedom and individuality when security seems assured. The push and pull between these poles generates recurring cycles in politics, culture, and social life. An important part of this recurrence lies in the transmission of ideas through what Richard Dawkins famously called memes. A meme, in this sense, is not the humorous internet image the word now evokes, but rather a unit of cultural transmission, an idea, belief, or practice that spreads from person to person in ways analogous to the spread of genes. Memes survive and thrive not because they are necessarily true or beneficial, but because they are easily replicable, emotionally resonant, and adaptable to different contexts. Religious doctrines, political slogans, conspiracy theories, and even fashions operate as memes, propagating themselves across generations and societies. Once established, memes can re-emerge long after their original context has faded, ensuring cultural repetition. This theory helps explain why certain ideas recur throughout history even after being discredited. Apocalyptic visions of the end of the world, for instance, have surfaced in countless eras, from early religious sects to modern doomsday movements. Despite repeated failures of such predictions, the meme of apocalypse endures because it resonates with deep fears and hopes, offering meaning in times of uncertainty. Similarly, authoritarian ideologies resurface under different guises, each time promising order, strength, or renewal in the face of perceived chaos. The meme of the strong leader is one of the most durable in human history, replicated across contexts from ancient monarchies to modern populist states. Cultural repetition is not limited to politics or religion. Artistic styles, musical trends, and fashion cycles also illustrate the meme-like nature of culture. Styles rise, become popular, lose novelty, fade, and eventually return with renewed appeal. These patterns reflect not only aesthetic shifts but also the deeper sociological principle that culture thrives on both continuity and change. The familiar provides comfort, while novelty provides excitement. The alternation between the two ensures that ideas and practices from the past never fully disappear but lie dormant until conditions allow them to flourish again. The repetition of history through group dynamics is further reinforced by the mechanisms of social learning. People often look to others to decide what to believe or how to act, especially in situations of uncertainty. This reliance on social cues ensures that once a behavior or belief takes hold in a group, it can spread rapidly, even if it lacks rational foundation. Financial bubbles provide striking examples. Investors buy assets not only because they judge them valuable but because others are buying them. The resulting cascade inflates prices beyond reason, until fear reverses the process and the bubble bursts. This cycle has occurred repeatedly across centuries, from tulips to dot-coms to cryptocurrencies, not because of ignorance of history but because the same social mechanisms are always at work. These dynamics suggest that the repetition of history is not a matter of coincidence but a consequence of predictable social laws. Just as physics can describe the movement of planets or chemistry the reactions of elements, sociology can illuminate the patterns by which groups form, act, and dissolve. The scientific study of crowds, movements, and memes reveals that human societies are not endlessly malleable but follow recurring trajectories shaped by the structure of collective behavior. Individual choices matter, but when aggregated into large groups, they often conform to the same underlying dynamics that have guided societies for centuries. Thus, the study of social dynamics offers a powerful explanation for why history repeats itself. The predictable behavior of crowds, the cyclical rise and fall of social movements, and the meme-like persistence of cultural patterns ensure that the past continually echoes in the present. Human beings may invent new technologies, new institutions, and new ideologies, but the collective forces that bind us together into groups remain constant. As long as we are social animals, subject to conformity, contagion, and cultural replication, history will continue to replay its themes, weaving familiar patterns into the unfolding story of civilization. Economics is often described as the engine of history, a force that drives nations toward prosperity or collapse, stability or upheaval. While political leaders, military strategies, or cultural innovations attract much of the attention in historical narratives, the rhythms of economic life provide the backdrop against which these dramas unfold. Over time, scholars have noticed that economies, rather than moving in smooth lines of growth, tend to oscillate in waves of expansion and contraction. These recurring patterns, booms, bubbles, crashes, and recoveries, have profound consequences for societies, shaping not only material well-being but also political stability, social cohesion, and cultural expression. The recognition of these cycles lies at the heart of understanding why history often returns to similar points despite apparent progress. One of the most influential observers of long-term economic rhythms was the Russian economist Nikolai Kondratiev, who in the early 20th century proposed the existence of long waves of economic activity, now often referred to as Kondratiev waves. According to his research, capitalist economies exhibit cycles lasting 40 to 60 years, each marked by phases of innovation-driven growth, saturation, stagnation, and decline. The Industrial Revolution, the rise of railroads, the spread of electricity, and later the Information Revolution can each be mapped onto such waves, with periods of prosperity giving way to crises and restructuring. Though debated, Kondratiev's theory highlights the idea that even over generations, economies tend to follow recurring arcs that societies cannot escape entirely. Alongside these long waves, shorter cycles were identified by other economists. Clement Juglar, a French physician-turned-economist, observed in the 19th century that business cycles of roughly 7 to 11 years recurred with striking regularity. He emphasized the role of credit and investment. Periods of expansion fueled by borrowing inevitably gave way to crises when debts could not be sustained, leading to contractions that cleared the ground for the next expansion. Later, Joseph Kitchin noted even shorter cycles of around 3 to 5 years, linked to inventory adjustments, production lags, and shifts in demand. Taken together, these overlapping cycles create a layered rhythm in which economies are constantly expanding and contracting at different scales, producing the turbulence we see in history. These theories are not simply academic curiosities, they provide a framework for understanding the recurrence of economic crises that punctuate history. The Great Depression of the 1930s, the oil shocks of the 1970s, the financial crisis of 2008, each seemed unprecedented in its time, yet all fit within the broader logic of economic cycles. In each case, periods of prosperity encouraged optimism, risk-taking, and overextension. In each case, underlying imbalances accumulated until they triggered collapse. The particular assets may change: railroads, real estate, dot-com stocks, mortgage-backed securities, but the process remains consistent: expansion, overconfidence, collapse, recovery, and renewal. Societies find themselves repeatedly at the mercy of these economic tides, regardless of their technological sophistication or political organization. The recurrence of crises has far-reaching social and political consequences. Economic downturns often destabilize governments, fuel populist movements, and intensify social conflicts. The Great Depression weakened liberal democracies and contributed to the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe, while the financial crisis of 2008 sparked waves of political disillusionment that continue to reverberate in the 21st century. Even ancient societies were not immune. Historians have documented economic collapses tied to resource depletion, trade disruptions, or fiscal mismanagement that contributed to the decline of empires such as Rome or the Mayan civilization. In each case, the inability to escape the rhythms of economic contraction brought societies back to familiar crises of inequality, unrest, and restructuring. Why do economies repeatedly return societies to similar points? Part of the explanation lies in the very structure of capitalism, which depends on cycles of investment and consumption. In times of growth, confidence breeds further expansion, often beyond sustainable limits. As profits increase, speculation intensifies, and eventually expectations detach from reality. When the inevitable correction arrives, the decline spreads rapidly because the same interconnected systems that magnified optimism now magnify fear. Human psychology plays its role, but the institutional framework of markets, credit, and investment ensures that cycles are not accidents but intrinsic to the way economies function. The repetition of history here is less about memory or ignorance and more about systemic dynamics that no society has yet found a way to escape. Another reason lies in the role of innovation. New technologies and industries fuel long waves of growth, but once they mature, the momentum slows. Railroads once transformed economies, but when networks were built out, the industry stagnated. The same pattern occurred with steel, electricity, and automobiles, and more recently with information technology. Each wave generates prosperity, urbanization, and social transformation, but it eventually runs its course, leaving behind both benefits and imbalances. Societies then enter a period of adjustment, often accompanied by crisis, until a new wave of innovation emerges. This cyclical pattern ties economic life to technological change in ways that continually reproduce both optimism and despair. Inequality also contributes to the recurrence of crises. Periods of growth often lead to concentrations of wealth and power in the hands of elites. Over time, this imbalance strains social cohesion, reduces demand from the broader population, and heightens resentment. When crises arrive, they expose these inequalities, sometimes violently. Revolutions and reforms often follow, redistributing resources or restructuring institutions, only for the cycle of concentration to begin again in subsequent generations. The repeated struggles over wealth distribution, from the land reforms of ancient Rome to the labor movements of the industrial era to contemporary debates about economic inequality, illustrate how deeply embedded this cycle is in the structure of economies. The predictability of economic cycles does not mean that history is predetermined, but it does suggest that societies are bound to face recurring challenges. Governments may implement regulations, central banks may intervene, and international institutions may seek stability, but the underlying dynamics of expansion and contraction persist. The challenge is not whether cycles exist but how societies manage them. Some respond with resilience, using downturns as opportunities for reform and renewal. Others collapse under the weight of crisis, opening the door to political upheaval or social fragmentation. In either case, the recurrence of economic turbulence remains a defining feature of human history. The study of economic cycles thus provides one of the clearest scientific explanations for why history repeats itself. Theories of Kondrativ, Juglar, and Kitchin offer different scales of rhythm, but together they reveal an underlying truth: economies are not linear engines of progress but oscillating systems that continually bring societies back to familiar points of prosperity, overreach, collapse, and recovery. As long as human beings depend on markets, credit, and innovation, these patterns will endure. History will continue to echo with the booms and busts of economic life, reminding us that progress, however real, always unfolds in waves. Politics, like economics, rarely follows a straight path of progress but instead seems to oscillate in rhythms that bring societies back to recurring states of strength, crisis, and renewal. Historians and political theorists have long observed that the story of states and empires is rarely one of indefinite ascent. Instead, it is marked by recurring cycles in which power is consolidated, flourishes, encounters crises, and eventually declines, often giving way to new forms of order that themselves begin the process again. This cycle of rise, flourishing, crisis, and decline has been visible across centuries and civilizations, from the Roman Empire to dynastic China to the contemporary experience of the United States. What is striking is not merely that each empire or great power faces challenges, but that the sequence of events repeats with enough regularity to suggest underlying laws at work. The Roman Empire is one of the clearest examples of this cyclical pattern. Rome began as a small republic, grew into a formidable power, and eventually expanded into a vast empire stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its rise was fueled by military conquest, administrative innovation, and the integration of diverse peoples into a shared political system. During its height, Rome enjoyed centuries of relative stability, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. Yet over time, strains emerged: political corruption, economic inequality, military overextension, and internal divisions. These weaknesses culminated in repeated crises that weakened the state until the Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century. The arc from rise to decline in Rome is mirrored in countless other civilizations, raising the question of whether the cycle is inevitable. China's history illustrates an even clearer pattern of repetition through its dynastic cycles. For thousands of years, Chinese history unfolded as a succession of dynasties that rose to power, consolidated authority, flourished, faced corruption and decline, and were ultimately replaced by new ruling houses. This cycle was so regular that it became enshrined in political philosophy through the concept of the mandate of heaven, which legitimized rulers when they governed effectively but justified their overthrow when they failed. Each new dynasty promised reform and renewal, only to repeat the same trajectory toward decay and collapse. The consistency of this cycle over such a vast expanse of time demonstrates that the repetition of political history is not confined to particular cultures but arises from enduring structural forces that shape all states. In more recent times, scholars have applied the same framework to the United States, suggesting that it too follows a cycle of political rise, flourishing, crisis, and possible decline. The United States emerged as a new kind of republic, expanded its influence through territorial growth and economic power, and eventually became the world's leading superpower. Yet many observers note familiar signs of strain, polarization, inequality, overextension in foreign conflicts, and declining trust in institutions. Whether or not the United States will follow the exact trajectory of Rome or China is uncertain, but the similarities suggest that great powers, regardless of their uniqueness, are subject to recurring dynamics of growth and decline. The cyclical view of politics was developed in greater depth by theorists such as Vilfredo Pareto and Gaetano Mosca, who examined the nature of elites and their role in shaping societies. Pareto argued that history is essentially a circulation of elites, in which one ruling group gradually loses its vitality and is replaced by another. For him, elites rise through qualities of strength, innovation, or cunning, but over time they become complacent, rigid, and self-serving. As they decline, new elites emerge from lower social strata, bringing fresh energy and ideas. This circulation ensures that no ruling group remains dominant forever, and it explains why history repeats itself in cycles of political renewal. Gaetano Mosca offered a similar perspective, emphasizing that in every society, a small minority, the ruling class, inevitably dominates the majority. He argued that while ruling classes justify their power through ideologies or legal systems, their authority always rests on organization, control of resources, and the ability to command loyalty. Like Pareto, Mosca believed that ruling classes decline over time as corruption and inefficiency set in, leading to crises that make them vulnerable to replacement. Together, Pareto and Mosca articulated a theory of political repetition grounded in the dynamics of elite behavior rather than the specific circumstances of any one society. Theories of political cycles are not limited to elites alone but extend to broader patterns of governance. States often expand power through centralization, military strength, and economic integration, only to encounter crises of legitimacy, resource strain, or internal division. The cycle plays out in monarchies, republics, and modern democracies alike, even if the mechanisms vary. In monarchies, dynastic succession often fails to maintain strong leadership across generations. In democracies, cycles of polarization, gridlock, and populism regularly undermine stability. In authoritarian regimes, power often consolidates rapidly but declines just as quickly when repression or economic stagnation weakens legitimacy. These variations demonstrate that while the details of political life differ, the cyclical nature of power remains constant. One reason for the recurrence of political cycles is the interaction between human psychology and institutional structures. Leaders and societies tend to repeat patterns of overreach, believing in the permanence of their success and neglecting the need for reform until crises erupt. Power breeds confidence, which can lead to expansionist policies or concentration of authority, but it also fosters complacency, corruption, and rigidity. When institutions fail to adapt, societies enter decline, opening the way for challenges. This interplay between confidence and complacency, strength and rigidity, ensures that no political system can escape cycles indefinitely. The repetition of political patterns also stems from structural challenges inherent in governance. States must balance order with freedom, unity with diversity, centralization with local autonomy, and strength with sustainability. These tensions are never permanently resolved but shift over time, producing recurring crises. For example, Rome struggled with the integration of conquered peoples, China with the balance between central power and regional interests, and modern democracies with the tension between elites and popular participation. Each society confronts these dilemmas anew, and while solutions vary, the recurrence of the problems ensures that history moves in cycles rather than in straight lines. Thus, the study of political regularities reveals another scientific basis for the repetition of history. Whether viewed through the lens of empires, the circulation of elites, or the structural dilemmas of governance, politics demonstrates predictable patterns of rise, flourishing, crisis, and decline. Rome, China, and the United States illustrate that even the most powerful states are not exempt from these rhythms. Pareto and Mosca's theories remind us that behind these cycles lies the persistent dynamic of ruling elites, whose rise and fall shape the broader course of history. The repetition of political patterns is not an accident of memory or coincidence, but an expression of the systemic forces that govern human societies. As long as power accumulates, consolidates, and decays, history will continue to bring societies back to familiar points, replaying the ancient drama of political life in ever new forms. Civilizations, no less than economies or political systems, seem to follow a pattern of growth, maturity, and eventual decline. From the earliest attempts to make sense of history, thinkers have noticed that cultures emerge with vitality and creativity, pass through periods of flourishing, and then settle into phases of stagnation or collapse. This cyclical interpretation of culture and civilization has been most famously developed by Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee, whose contrasting yet complementary theories highlight how the destinies of entire civilizations repeat in ways that are strikingly similar despite vast differences in geography and time. Their insights offer another dimension to the scientific understanding of historical repetition, showing that cultural life itself is not linear progress but a rhythm of birth, growth, and decay. Spengler, in his monumental work The Decline of the West, argued that civilizations are akin to living organisms, each with its own life cycle. According to his theory, cultures are born out of a burst of creativity, often marked by myth, art, and religion that reflect a unique soul or worldview. As these cultures mature, they develop political structures, scientific achievements, and expansive economies. But over time, vitality is lost, and what was once a vibrant culture ossifies into what Spengler called a civilization, a rigid and mechanized form of existence that signals decline. For Spengler, the West in the early 20th century was already moving from the cultural vitality of earlier centuries into a phase of exhausted civilization, destined to repeat the fate of Rome and other great societies before it. His perspective, though controversial, resonates with the recurring observation that cultural creativity eventually fades, leaving behind structures that can persist for a time but lack the capacity for renewal. Toynbee offered a more dynamic and less fatalistic interpretation. In his multi-volume A Study of History, he proposed that civilizations rise and fall based on their ability to respond to challenges. According to Toynbee, a civilization is born when a society successfully meets a challenge, whether environmental, social, or external. It grows through creative responses, often led by a creative minority that inspires and organizes society. Over time, however, the creative minority becomes a dominant minority, more concerned with preserving its privileges than with guiding renewal. As the majority becomes disillusioned, the civilization enters decline, eventually disintegrating when challenges overwhelm its capacity to adapt. Toynbee's framework suggests that cycles are not predetermined but arise from the dynamic relationship between societies and their environments, with repetition rooted in recurring failures of leadership and adaptability. When Spengler and Toynbee are compared, what emerges is a powerful synthesis of biological metaphor and sociological analysis. Both recognize that civilizations are not immortal. They follow arcs of vitality and exhaustion, creativity and stagnation. Yet Toynbee's emphasis on challenge and response leaves open the possibility that some societies may renew themselves and prolong their flourishing, while Spengler's vision stresses inevitability. Together, their theories illuminate why so many civilizations, from Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece, Rome, China, India, and the modern West, have followed similar arcs, even as their specific cultural expressions differ. A closer look at East and West illustrates these patterns further. In the West, cultural cycles have often been tied to periods of dramatic innovation followed by consolidation and eventual decline. The classical world of Greece and Rome produced philosophies, arts, and political forms that defined an era, but eventually ossified and gave way to decline. The Renaissance and Enlightenment marked another wave of cultural creativity, producing advances in science, humanism, and politics that underpinned the modern era. Yet observers such as Spengler argue that the modern West, with its mechanization, bureaucratization, and declining spiritual vitality, is already entering a phase of rigidity. Whether or not one accepts this conclusion, the repeated pattern of birth, brilliance, and exhaustion is difficult to deny. In the East, particularly in China and India, cycles of cultural flourishing and decline appear just as vividly, though they unfold in distinct forms. China's dynastic cycles were not only political but cultural, with each dynasty bringing artistic innovation, literary achievement, and philosophical refinement, followed by periods of stagnation and collapse. India's history, too, is marked by waves of cultural creativity under different empires and religious movements, each contributing to a rich civilizational legacy but each also subject to decline when vitality waned. Unlike the West, however, where cultural collapse often coincided with political disintegration, Eastern civilizations displayed remarkable continuity. Chinese culture, despite political cycles of rise and fall, persisted for millennia, suggesting that cultural repetition in the East often preserved continuity alongside renewal. The comparison between East and West raises profound questions about whether civilizations truly die or whether they transform and adapt. Western history often appears to move in more dramatic cycles of collapse and rebirth, while Eastern civilizations seem to renew themselves more gradually, preserving a deeper sense of continuity. Yet in both cases, the rhythm of cultural vitality and decline remains evident. Civilizations that fail to respond to challenges or lose their creative drive eventually find themselves repeating the same crises of legitimacy, fragmentation, and stagnation, regardless of their cultural distinctiveness. Underlying these cycles is the fundamental tension between creativity and structure. Cultures are born in creativity when myths, arts, and religions infuse societies with meaning and vitality. Over time, institutions are built to preserve and transmit this creativity, but institutions eventually become rigid, prioritizing preservation over innovation. When institutions dominate, creativity fades, and the culture enters decline. This dynamic explains why the history of civilizations often feels like a repetition of youthful energy giving way to aging rigidity. Even when new forms arise, they often follow the same path, repeating the ancient rhythm of growth and exhaustion. Thus, cultural and civilizational cycles provide another scientific lens through which to understand the repetition of history. Spengler's organic metaphor and Toynbee's challenge-response framework converge on the conclusion that civilizations are not permanent but subject to recurring phases of vitality and decline. The comparison of East and West demonstrates that while the tempo and continuity of cycles may differ, the underlying rhythm remains the same. History repeats itself not because people forget, but because civilizations, like living beings, are bound to rhythms of birth, flourishing, and eventual exhaustion. The repetition of cultural history is therefore a structural feature of human existence, one that ensures that even the most brilliant achievements are eventually followed by familiar patterns of decline and transformation. Technology has always been one of the central forces driving historical change, yet paradoxically it has also played a key role in reinforcing the very cycles that humanity seems unable to escape. Each great technological breakthrough, from the wheel to the steam engine to the internet, has promised transformation, liberation, and a break from the limitations of the past. And yet, when these breakthroughs have unfolded, they have repeatedly triggered scenarios that bear striking resemblance to earlier patterns of conflict, inequality, and crisis. The paradox of progress lies in the fact that even as new tools and machines allow societies to accelerate, expand, and innovate, they also reproduce and intensify the same underlying dynamics of competition, ambition, and fear that have shaped human history for millennia. Far from escaping repetition, technological advances often ensure that old models return with renewed force and speed. The invention of the wheel, one of the earliest and most fundamental technological breakthroughs, dramatically expanded human capacity to transport goods, organize societies, and wage war. With the wheel came the chariot, which transformed ancient warfare, giving rise to new forms of conquest and empire. What began as a tool for trade and mobility became an instrument of domination, repeating the age-old pattern of technological advances being turned toward conflict. Ancient empires used wheeled transport to expand their armies and control vast territories, replicating the logic of competition and expansion that had defined earlier societies on a smaller scale. In this sense, even the earliest technologies demonstrate how innovation does not erase historical repetition but amplifies it. The Industrial Revolution and the invention of the steam engine provide another clear example. The steam engine revolutionized production, transportation, and communication, allowing societies to grow wealthier and more interconnected. But alongside unprecedented growth came new forms of inequality, exploitation, and imperial rivalry. Industrialization fueled social upheaval as workers were displaced, urban centers became overcrowded, and class tensions rose. It also intensified competition between states, as nations raced to secure resources, markets, and colonies. The same recurring scenarios, economic crises, wars, revolutions, emerged on a grander scale, driven forward by the very technology that was supposed to transcend the limitations of the past. The 19th and 20th centuries, marked by industrial wars and economic depressions, revealed how the steam engine and its offspring did not free humanity from repetition but accelerated the cycles of expansion, crisis, and conflict that had always characterized history. The Internet and digital technologies represent the latest chapter in this paradox of progress. Initially celebrated as a tool for global connection, democratization of knowledge, and unprecedented freedom, the Internet has also reproduced familiar patterns of power, manipulation, and inequality. Far from creating a new world immune to old problems, digital technologies have become battlegrounds for control, surveillance, and disinformation. Just as the printing press once spread both enlightenment and propaganda, the Internet has amplified both truth and falsehood. The promise of liberation has been accompanied by renewed cycles of polarization, exploitation, and conflict, now unfolding at the speed of light. Cyber warfare, online radicalization, and digital monopolies echo the same struggles over power and resources that have defined every era, simply transposed into a new technological medium. The deeper reason why technologies reproduce historical patterns lies in the fact that they do not exist independently of human nature. Tools amplify human capacities, but they cannot alter the basic structures of fear, ambition, greed, and desire for power that drive behavior. A new technology becomes embedded in existing social and political systems, which are shaped by recurring human dynamics. Thus, the wheel enabled conquest because humans already sought dominance, the steam engine fueled imperial rivalry because nations already pursued expansion, and the internet has been weaponized because humans already wage battles over truth and influence. The technology changes the scale, speed, and form of the conflict, but the underlying dynamics remain constant, ensuring repetition. Another aspect of technological repetition lies in the way advances create unintended consequences that mirror earlier crises. Industrialization, for example, was meant to create abundance, yet it generated cycles of boom and bust that echoed older agricultural shortages and famines. Digitalization promised efficiency and freedom, yet it has produced cycles of dependency and vulnerability, as societies become reliant on fragile networks and exposed to new forms of disruption. In this sense, progress continually produces problems that mirror those of the past, even as the context and tools change. Humanity finds itself locked in an ongoing cycle in which every breakthrough produces both liberation and repetition. Wars provide some of the most dramatic evidence of this paradox. Each new weapon, from bronze swords to nuclear bombs, has been hailed as a tool that could end conflict by making war too costly or too decisive. Yet each innovation has instead set the stage for renewed arms races, power struggles, and catastrophic wars. The machine gun and artillery were supposed to make war quick and decisive, but they gave rise to the trench stalemate of World War I. Nuclear weapons were said to guarantee peace through deterrence, yet they have created a perpetual cycle of fear, proliferation, and brinkmanship. Digital technologies were meant to connect the world, yet they are already being deployed in cyberwars that replicate the same old logic of attack, defense, and escalation. In each case, the promise of an end to conflict gave way to the reality of repeated scenarios, now magnified by technological force. The paradox of technological progress, then, is that it does not lead to linear escape from the past but to the acceleration of its rhythms. Technologies compress time, allowing societies to experience cycles more rapidly. Economic crises now ripple across the globe in days, wars can be launched and fought in seconds, and cultural shifts unfold almost overnight. This acceleration makes it appear that history is changing faster than ever, yet the scenarios themselves, competition, expansion, crisis, decline, remain familiar. What changes is not the structure but the tempo, with technology ensuring that humanity repeats old patterns at greater speed and intensity. In this way, technology becomes not the end of historical repetition but one of its most powerful drivers. Breakthroughs such as the wheel, the steam engine, and the internet have undeniably transformed human existence, expanding possibilities and reshaping societies. Yet they have also triggered the same recurring scenarios of war, crisis, inequality, and overreach that have always defined history. The paradox of progress is that the very tools meant to liberate humanity ensure that old models return, accelerated and intensified. As long as technologies are shaped by human psychology and social structures, they will remain bound to the cycles that repeat across history, perpetuating the rhythm of innovation and repetition that defines the human story. Throughout history, the environment has acted as an invisible but decisive player in shaping the cycles of rise, flourishing, and decline of societies. While human beings often imagine themselves as masters of nature, bending resources and landscapes to their will, the deeper truth is that ecological and material limits have consistently reasserted themselves, forcing civilizations into crises when they overreach. Resource depletion, soil exhaustion, deforestation, and climate fluctuations have again and again pushed societies to the brink, producing collapses that echo each other across centuries and continents. Even in the modern age of technological sophistication, humanity remains bound to these environmental constraints, and the repetition of ecological crises suggests that the natural world functions as one of the most reliable engines of historical recurrence. The case of Easter Island offers a stark and well-known example. The island society achieved remarkable cultural feats, most famously the construction of the massive stone statues, or moai, which required enormous labor and resources. Yet the very success of this culture rested on intensive use of the island's limited resources, particularly its forests. Over time, deforestation became so extreme that the islanders could no longer build canoes, sustain agricultural productivity, or support their population. Social tensions grew, leading to conflict, starvation, and eventually collapse. Easter Island's trajectory illustrates how resource overuse can trigger a predictable sequence. Prosperity encourages overexploitation, environmental degradation undermines stability, and crisis follows. The same pattern has appeared elsewhere, even if the details differ, suggesting that resource depletion consistently drives historical repetition. The collapse of the Maya civilization provides another example of ecological stress leading to repetition. The Maya achieved high levels of cultural sophistication, building cities, developing astronomy, and constructing elaborate systems of governance. Yet their society was heavily dependent on intensive agriculture in a region vulnerable to drought. Periods of climatic stress strained their capacity to feed large populations, while ongoing warfare between rival city-states compounded instability. Archaeological and environmental evidence suggests that prolonged droughts played a key role in undermining the Maya's political and social structures, leading to depopulation and abandonment of cities. Once again, we see the familiar cycle: growth encourages overextension, the environment imposes limits, and societies face decline when they cannot adapt. The repetition lies not in the specific crops or political systems but in the structural relationship between human ambition and ecological reality. Even great empires with vast resources have not escaped these cycles. The Roman Empire, at its height, controlled immense territories and economies, yet it too suffered from environmental constraints. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, and reliance on grain imports created vulnerabilities that were exacerbated by political and military pressures. Climatic changes in late antiquity further strained agricultural systems, contributing to famines, population movements, and the weakening of imperial stability. Rome's decline was not solely ecological, but environmental stress played a significant role in amplifying recurring crises of governance and legitimacy. Once again, environmental factors served as the hidden force that reinforced historical repetition, reminding us that even powerful civilizations cannot ignore the constraints of their ecological base. Modern societies face similar dynamics on a global scale. Industrialization and technological progress have vastly increased humanity's ability to extract and consume resources, but they have not freed us from environmental limits. Fossil fuel dependence, deforestation, biodiversity loss, and climate change represent the contemporary version of the same cycle that brought down earlier civilizations. Economic growth encourages greater exploitation of resources, which leads to degradation and crisis when limits are reached. Climate change in particular highlights the repeating pattern. Human ambition to expand production and consumption collides with the atmosphere's limited capacity to absorb carbon, leading to destabilization of weather, agriculture, and ecosystems. The difference today is that the scale is global, but the structure of the cycle is strikingly familiar. The repetition of ecological crises across history suggests that they are not anomalies but structural features of human existence. Societies tend to treat resources as inexhaustible during periods of growth, only to confront scarcity when ecological systems falter. This dynamic creates predictable rhythms of expansion and collapse. The forests of Easter Island, the fields of the Maya, the soils of Rome, and today's fossil fuel reserves all reflect the same principle: human activity, when unchecked, undermines its own foundations. Crises emerge not from random misfortune but from systemic patterns of overuse and short-term thinking, which repeat because human psychology and social systems encourage immediate gain over long-term sustainability. The invisibility of ecology as a historical actor contributes to repetition. Political leaders and social groups often focus on immediate rivals, wars, or economic struggles, overlooking the slower but more decisive pressures of environmental change. The consequences of resource depletion accumulate gradually, making them easy to ignore until the crisis becomes acute. By the time societies recognize ecological limits, they are often locked into trajectories of decline. This blindness to environmental feedback has been repeated throughout history, making ecology one of the most consistent sources of cyclical crisis. The modern climate crisis reveals that despite technological progress, humanity continues to follow the same script. Warnings about resource limits and environmental degradation are frequently overshadowed by economic and political priorities. Even as climate change produces increasingly visible consequences, rising seas, extreme weather, food insecurity, societies struggle to adapt, much as ancient civilizations failed to adjust to droughts, soil loss, or deforestation. The difference now lies in the global interconnectedness of the problem, but the repetition of denial, overuse, and eventual confrontation with limits remains unchanged. What emerges from these examples is the recognition that ecological limits are not external accidents but integral forces shaping the repetition of history. Societies rise when they harness resources effectively, and they decline when those resources are exhausted or degraded. This rhythm has unfolded across small islands, vast empires, and now the entire planet. The pattern persists because human beings, driven by growth and ambition, repeatedly ignore or underestimate the constraints of their environment. As a result, history continually echoes with the same cycles of expansion, overexploitation, and collapse, even as the technologies and cultures involved differ. Thus, ecology must be understood as one of the central engines of historical repetition. The environment, though often invisible in political narratives, consistently shapes outcomes by imposing limits that no society can permanently escape. The stories of Easter Island, the Maya, Rome, and today's climate challenges all illustrate how resource depletion and ecological stress trigger familiar crises. Progress may change the scale and speed of these interactions, but it does not eliminate the underlying dynamic. Human history, in this light, can be seen as a series of variations on the same ecological theme: growth, overreach, and decline under the unyielding pressure of environmental limits. History, when examined closely, does not unfold in a simple linear fashion where one event predictably causes the next in a straight line. Instead, it often resembles a nonlinear system, a complex field where small influences can produce disproportionately large outcomes and where long periods of stability can be shattered suddenly by rapid change. The application of chaos theory and nonlinear dynamics to historical processes allows us to see that repetition in human affairs is not a mechanical cycle but rather the product of systems that oscillate between order and instability, where thresholds of stability are crossed and familiar crises return. The metaphor of the butterfly effect, where the flap of a butterfly's wings can contribute to the formation of a hurricane across the globe, captures the sensitivity of historical systems to initial conditions and explains why seemingly minor actions can catalyze massive and recurring transformations. At the heart of nonlinear dynamics is the recognition that complex systems, whether physical, biological, or social, do not always behave proportionally to the forces that act upon them. A small disturbance in a balanced system might be absorbed without consequence, but at certain thresholds it can cascade into a crisis. History provides countless examples of such tipping points. A minor political assassination can ignite a world war, a local protest can spark a revolution, a small financial panic can trigger a global depression. The recurrence of these disproportionate responses suggests that societies function as non-linear systems where underlying tensions accumulate until even a small spark can set off dramatic change. The repetition lies not in the details of the spark but in the systemic dynamic of tension, threshold, and release. Chaos theory emphasizes the sensitivity of outcomes to initial conditions, which in history means that small, often unnoticed decisions can alter trajectories in profound ways. Consider the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. The act itself was carried out by a small group of radicals, with little expectation of reshaping the world. Yet in the context of rival alliances, arms races, and accumulated tensions, the event cascaded into the First World War, a conflict that reshaped global politics for the entire 20th century. Here we see the butterfly effect in historical form, a seemingly minor act, amplified by systemic fragility, unleashes vast and repeated consequences. Comparable scenarios appear throughout history, underscoring that nonlinear systems ensure the return of crises when thresholds are breached. Social systems exhibit stability up to certain limits, but once those thresholds are exceeded, they enter states of rapid transformation. The French Revolution provides an illustration of this dynamic. For decades, the monarchy maintained a precarious balance despite financial strain, social inequality, and popular discontent. But the combination of harvest failures, fiscal mismanagement, and political missteps pushed the system beyond its threshold. Suddenly, stability gave way to upheaval, as if a non-linear system had reached its tipping point. The repetition lies in the pattern. Societies accumulate stress while appearing stable, and then, often unpredictably, collapse into revolutionary change when a threshold is passed. This pattern has recurred in many contexts, from the Russian Revolution to the Arab Spring, suggesting that non-linear transitions are a structural feature of history. The idea of attractors in chaos theory is also illuminating. In nonlinear systems, certain states act like attractors, pulling the system toward recurring patterns. In history, attractors can be seen in the repeated emergence of empire, revolution, economic boom and bust, or authoritarian consolidation. These states are not inevitable in a deterministic sense, but they represent stable configurations toward which societies are drawn when underlying dynamics align. The repeated rise and fall of empires, for instance, may be understood as a kind of historical attractor, expansion creates instability, instability leads to crisis, crisis results in fragmentation, and the cycle repeats. Nonlinear dynamics suggests that even when the details differ, systems gravitate toward familiar outcomes because these outcomes represent relatively stable solutions to recurring tensions. Another critical insight from nonlinear thinking is the unpredictability embedded within systems. While broad patterns recur, the specific form they take is impossible to predict with precision. This explains why history never repeats itself exactly but always with variation. The butterfly effect ensures that small differences in timing, leadership, or environment produce unique manifestations of larger patterns. The Roman Republic and the United States may both display cycles of expansion, internal division, and political crisis, but the details diverge because initial conditions and specific choices differ. What repeats is the structure of instability, not the exact sequence of events. Nonlinear history, therefore, explains both the familiarity of cycles and the uniqueness of each case. Nonlinear dynamics also highlight feedback loops, where actions amplify their own effects in spirals of escalation. Financial markets provide clear examples. A small loss of confidence leads to selling, which drives down prices, which further undermines confidence, producing a crash. Similar feedback mechanisms operate in politics and society. Repression of protest can fuel more protest, war mobilization can provoke counter-mobilization, propaganda can create polarization that intensifies its own effects. These loops create self-reinforcing cycles that recur across eras, giving history its repetitive quality. The specific triggers may differ, but the feedback structure remains consistent, ensuring that crises echo across centuries. Thresholds of social stability are particularly important in understanding why repetition occurs. Human societies often build systems that appear stable but are in fact finely balanced. Populations grow until resources are strained, governments centralize power until legitimacy falters, economies expand until debt becomes unsustainable. In each case, the system can function smoothly for long periods, lulling participants into complacency, until suddenly the threshold is crossed and collapse ensues. The repetition of this sequence reflects the nonlinear dynamics of systems under stress. Stability breeds overextension, overextension pushes systems to thresholds, and thresholds produce sudden, recurring collapses. The butterfly effect in history also reminds us of the limits of prediction. Because small causes can have vast consequences, and because initial conditions can never be fully known, exact forecasting of historical events is impossible. Yet what can be recognized are the patterns of sensitivity, the recurring structures of instability that ensure crises will occur, even if their precise form is uncertain. This is why historians and social scientists can speak of cycles without predicting exact outcomes. They recognize the nonlinear tendencies that draw societies into repeating rhythms. The paradox of historical science is that broad repetition is predictable, but the details remain unknowable due to the inherent chaos of human systems. Understanding history as a nonlinear system does not negate human agency, but it places that agency within a field of constraints and sensitivities. Leaders and societies make choices, but the impact of those choices is conditioned by systemic fragility. A wise decision can stabilize a system, while a minor error can push it past a threshold into collapse. The recurrence of crises, wars, and revolutions reflects not just human psychology or ecological limits but the mathematical logic of nonlinear systems, where sensitivity, thresholds, feedback loops, and attractors ensure that history never flows smoothly but instead oscillates through familiar cycles of stability and chaos. Thus, chaos theory and nonlinear dynamics provide a framework for understanding why history repeats. They reveal that societies are not linear machines but complex systems that accumulate tensions, cross thresholds, and fall into familiar attractors. The butterfly effect ensures that small events can unleash large consequences, thresholds of stability explain sudden collapses, and feedback loops drive recurring cycles. History, seen in this light, is neither fully determined nor fully random, but a nonlinear system where repetition emerges from the interaction of order and chaos. This perspective not only explains the recurrence of historical scenarios but also highlights the delicate balance on which human societies always rest, perpetually vulnerable to both the weight of accumulated tensions and the unpredictable flap of a butterfly's wings. One of the most striking paradoxes of history is the inability of societies to learn permanently from their past mistakes. Time and again, nations repeat the same errors, whether in waging unwinnable wars, falling into speculative financial bubbles, or allowing authoritarianism to rise under the promise of stability. This phenomenon cannot be explained solely by structural forces like economics or ecology, it also arises from the peculiar dynamics of collective memory and forgetting. Human groups, unlike individuals, cannot retain experience indefinitely. Knowledge and lessons are mediated through culture, institutions, and intergenerational transmission, which are fragile, selective, and easily distorted. As a result, societies continually reinvent the wheel, repeating both successes and failures because the mechanisms of memory are inherently limited. Generational psychology plays a central role in this cycle. Every generation inherits the world shaped by its predecessors, but its memory of past crises is filtered through distance and interpretation. Those who lived through war, famine, or collapse often retain a visceral sense of caution, shaping their decisions in ways designed to prevent recurrence. Yet as that generation passes, the immediacy of the experience fades. The next generation may know the facts but not the lived reality, while the third generation may regard the crisis as ancient history, irrelevant to present concerns. This three-generational cycle has been noted repeatedly. The builders of peace are followed by cautious heirs, and then by descendants who, lacking memory, repeat the same mistakes. The recurrence of wars and financial crashes follows this rhythm, suggesting that forgetting is not an accident but an inevitable feature of human society. Collective memory is also vulnerable to distortion. What societies remember is shaped by narratives, myths, and ideologies rather than objective truth. Governments and elites often reshape the past to serve present needs, emphasizing victories, minimizing defeats, or reframing failures as heroic struggles. Such selective memory creates blind spots, preventing future generations from recognizing the warning signs of crisis. For example, the tendency of states to glorify past wars while downplaying their costs fosters a culture where new wars appear attractive, despite the lessons of devastation. Similarly, financial markets tend to erase memories of crashes during booms, as optimism and narratives of progress overwhelm cautionary tales. Forgetting, in this sense, is actively produced by cultural mechanisms that prioritize pride, unity, or growth over painful honesty. There is also a psychological mechanism of denial at work. Societies, like individuals, often refuse to confront unpleasant realities, preferring to suppress or reinterpret them rather than integrate their lessons. This denial may take the form of blaming external enemies for crises rather than acknowledging internal flaws, or of insisting that this time is different whenever warning signs of repetition emerge. Such denial perpetuates cycles, as it prevents recognition of the systemic causes of failure. For example, despite centuries of experience with debt bubbles, modern economies continue to repeat them because each generation convinces itself that new technologies or institutions have rendered the old lessons obsolete. This pattern of willful forgetting ensures that experience is not truly assimilated and mistakes are repeated. The medium of historical transmission further reinforces these limitations. While individuals pass down stories, documents, and monuments, the act of remembering always involves simplification. Complex crises are reduced to slogans, symbols, or moral lessons that often miss the structural dynamics. Wars may be remembered as struggles of good versus evil, revolutions as triumphs of liberty or chaos, collapses as the fault of enemies or leaders. The nuance that might prevent repetition is lost in the simplification necessary for collective memory to function. In this way, memory preserves meaning but not mechanism, making repetition almost inevitable. Technology and modern information systems have not eliminated this problem but in some ways have intensified it. The sheer volume of information available can overwhelm rather than clarify, leading societies to focus on simplified narratives that fit immediate needs. The rapid turnover of news and the emphasis on novelty accelerate forgetting, as past crises fade quickly from public consciousness. Even events as significant as global wars or financial meltdowns recede into abstraction within a few decades, leaving future generations vulnerable to reenacting their mistakes. The paradox of an age saturated with memory tools is that forgetting occurs faster, as constant stimulation pushes older lessons out of relevance. Ultimately, the repetition of historical mistakes through forgetting reveals a deep tension in human society. On the one hand, individuals may remember vividly and even attempt to warn the future, but collective structures cannot hold memory indefinitely in ways that preserve its full meaning. Generational turnover, cultural distortion, denial, and the simplification of transmission guarantee that the hard-won lessons of one era will be diminished in the next. This creates the conditions for repetition, as new generations, unburdened by past trauma, approach old challenges with dangerous confidence. The wheel of history turns not because people consciously choose to ignore the past, but because the very mechanisms of memory ensure that forgetting is built into the structure of human existence. The idea that history might be predictable in the same way as natural phenomena has long fascinated thinkers. Traditionally, history was viewed as a realm of human freedom, chance, and contingency, resisting any attempt at scientific modeling. Yet in the modern age, scholars have increasingly sought to apply mathematical tools and systems theory to historical dynamics, aiming to uncover the hidden regularities behind recurring events. The most ambitious of these approaches is cryodynamics, a discipline pioneered by Peter Turchin, which attempts to use quantitative data and mathematical models to trace cycles of instability, prosperity, and collapse across societies. By analyzing long-term patterns such as population growth, economic inequality, and elite overproduction, cryodynamics suggests that repetition in history is not merely metaphorical but grounded in measurable social mechanisms. At the core of cryodynamics lies the recognition that large-scale social processes can be modeled statistically, much as ecologists model predator-prey dynamics or demographers track population growth. Turchin's models highlight how demographic pressures, economic inequality, and the competition among elites for limited positions of power create predictable cycles of social tension. When inequality widens and the number of aspirant elites exceeds the positions available, societies enter periods of instability that often culminate in revolutions, civil wars, or systemic collapse. These dynamics are not deterministic in the sense of predicting exact events but provide probabilistic forecasts of when instability is likely to occur. Historical repetition thus appears as the result of structural pressures that re-emerge whenever certain thresholds are crossed, producing patterns observable across different civilizations and time periods. Mathematical models of history extend beyond cliodynamics into the study of economic and political cycles. Economists have long attempted to quantify periodic crises, identifying regularities such as condrative waves, jugular cycles, and shorter-term fluctuations. Similarly, political scientists have developed models of regime durability and collapse, analyzing variables such as legitimacy, coercive capacity, and institutional resilience. These models operate on the assumption that social systems, like physical systems, can be abstracted into measurable components whose interactions generate recurring outcomes. By feeding historical data into such models, researchers aim to forecast when societies are approaching danger zones, much as seismologists identify areas of high earthquake risk. The repetition of crises is no longer seen as a mystery but as the product of interacting variables that can be tracked and modeled. Yet the attempt to predict history raises fundamental questions about the limits of science in the realm of human affairs. One challenge is the inherent complexity of social systems, which involve countless actors, decisions, and contingencies. Unlike the relatively closed systems of physics, history is open-ended, influenced by unique events, innovations, and personalities. The butterfly effect, central to chaos theory, reminds us that small variations can alter trajectories dramatically, making precise predictions impossible. At best, models can identify broad trends and probabilities, not specific events. Turchin himself acknowledges that cliodynamics forecasts windows of instability rather than precise outcomes. For instance, his prediction that the United States would face a period of turbulence around the 2020s was borne out by political polarization and unrest, yet the exact sequence of events, pandemics, protests, and elections, could not have been foreseen. Another limitation lies in the quality of data. Historical records are incomplete, biased, and often difficult to translate into quantifiable variables. To model cycles stretching back centuries requires approximations and assumptions that inevitably introduce uncertainty. Moreover, societies differ in culture, institutions, and geography, which means that models built from one context may not apply universally. While the general pattern of elite overproduction and inequality leading to unrest appears robust, the specific manifestations vary widely, making universal prediction elusive. Thus, while mathematical models can capture recurring dynamics, they cannot eliminate the uniqueness of each historical case. Despite these limits, the attempt to model history has profound implications. First, it challenges the belief that crises are purely accidental or products of bad leadership. Instead, it suggests that structural forces make certain outcomes likely regardless of individual choices. This perspective reframes history as a field where human freedom operates within constraints, much like a ship navigating currents and tides. Leaders may steer, but the underlying forces of demography, economy, and inequality shape the direction of movement. Second, predictive models offer practical benefits. If societies can identify when they are entering danger zones, periods of heightened instability, they may take measures to mitigate risks, such as reforming institutions, reducing inequality, or expanding opportunities for rising elites. In this way, the science of history, though limited, could provide tools for prevention. Skeptics argue, however, that even if such models reveal broad tendencies, human behavior resists reduction to equations. The act of predicting history may itself alter outcomes, as awareness of the forecast influences decisions. This reflexivity distinguishes social systems from natural systems. A predicted revolution may be avoided precisely because the prediction prompts reform, while a predicted boom may collapse because actors overestimate its durability. Models of history, therefore, are not neutral descriptions but interventions in the very processes they aim to study. This complicates the goal of forecasting repetition, as prediction and outcome become entangled. The debate over whether history can be predicted scientifically reflects a deeper philosophical tension between determinism and contingency. On one side is the conviction that structural forces, demography, economics, ecology, generate cycles that make repetition unavoidable. On the other side is the belief that human creativity, agency, and chance events ensure that no two historical moments are ever truly alike. In practice, both perspectives hold truth. Models can identify recurring patterns and probabilities, but they cannot account fully for the unpredictable innovations, leaders, or accidents that reshape the course of events. The repetition of history is real but never identical, a rhythm shaped by structural forces but always inflected by contingency. Ultimately, the promise of scientific models in history lies not in perfect prediction but in heightened awareness. By recognizing the recurring dynamics of inequality, elite competition, and demographic pressure, societies can better understand the conditions that lead to crisis. By applying quantitative analysis to long-term data, historians and social scientists move closer to treating history as a science, not merely a narrative. Yet the unpredictability inherent in nonlinear systems ensures that repetition will always carry an element of surprise. History may rhyme in ways that are recognizable and even measurable, but it will never be fully scripted in advance. The attempt to predict repetition thus reveals both the power and the limits of scientific reasoning in human affairs, offering insights into recurring patterns while reminding us of the irreducible complexity of the human story. When we turn from the past to the future, the central question is whether the repetition of historical scenarios will persist or whether humanity, equipped with new technologies and insights, might finally break the cycle. Optimists argue that history is not doomed to endless recurrence, that the knowledge of past mistakes combined with unprecedented tools for coordination and foresight can allow societies to chart a different path. Pessimists, by contrast, see repetition as inevitable, grounded in the biological and psychological structures of human beings and the systemic constraints of finite resources, power struggles, and collective memory. The tension between these views shapes contemporary debates about the trajectory of civilization in the 21st century and beyond. Optimists point to the transformative potential of technology and global integration. Never before has humanity possessed such capacity to analyze its own history, simulate possible futures, and coordinate responses to global threats. Artificial intelligence, big data, and complex systems modeling allow for a degree of foresight that earlier societies could not imagine. Whereas past civilizations stumbled blindly into crises of famine, war, or ecological collapse, modern societies can identify warning signals years or even decades in advance. For instance, Climate models give a detailed picture of likely consequences if greenhouse gas emissions continue unchecked, offering a chance for preventative action. Similarly, predictive analytics in economics and politics aim to reduce the likelihood of catastrophic surprises. From this perspective, repetition is not destiny but the product of ignorance, and with greater knowledge, the cycles can be softened or redirected. Globalization further reinforces the optimistic case. In the past, civilizations often collapsed in isolation, cut off from one another, repeating similar patterns of rise and fall with little opportunity to learn from distant examples. Today, however, information circulates instantly across borders, making the experiences of one society immediately available to all others. This interconnectedness allows for collective learning on a scale never seen before. An economic crisis in one region provides lessons for another, a pandemic in one country generates a global response infrastructure. Advocates of global governance believe that international institutions, though imperfect, create mechanisms to prevent the repetition of certain scenarios, such as world wars between great powers. The creation of organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization reflects the belief that coordinated action can short-circuit destructive cycles. Yet pessimists counter that despite these new tools, the underlying drivers of repetition remain intact. Human psychology has not fundamentally changed. Fear, greed, and the pursuit of power continue to shape decision-making. The very technologies that optimists celebrate can also magnify ancient patterns of conflict and exploitation. Artificial intelligence may empower unprecedented cooperation, but it also enables new forms of surveillance, manipulation, and warfare. Globalization can spread solutions, but it can just as easily spread crises, turning local failures into global catastrophes. Financial crashes, pandemics, and ecological disasters now ripple across the planet with unprecedented speed, making repetition not less likely but more dangerous. From this perspective, progress accelerates the recurrence of old patterns rather than overcoming them. Moreover, the ecological limits of the planet impose constraints that no amount of technology or coordination can fully escape. The overexploitation of resources, the degradation of ecosystems, and the destabilization of the climate mirror pattern seen in earlier collapses, from Easter Island to the Maya, only on a global scale. Unlike past civilizations, there is no untouched frontier or external reservoir of resources to cushion the fall. The repetition of ecological collapse, pessimists warn, may be inevitable unless humanity radically alters its relationship with the natural world. Far from breaking the cycle, modernity may be setting the stage for a final and irreversible version of it. The debate thus centers on whether cycles are rooted more in ignorance and lack of coordination, which can be overcome, or in deep structures of human behavior and ecology, which cannot. In reality, the future likely contains elements of both. Humanity may succeed in mitigating certain forms of repetition, avoiding global wars between superpowers, for instance, while remaining trapped in others, such as economic inequality and ecological stress. The promise of AI and global governance is real, but so are the dangers of misuse and unintended consequences. Just as the printing press both advanced knowledge and fueled religious wars, so too will modern technologies prove ambivalent, creating opportunities for progress while reviving old dangers in new forms. The possibility of breaking the cycle ultimately depends on whether societies can transcend the biological and psychological impulses that drive repetition. Some argue that cultural evolution is faster than biological evolution and that humanity is capable of reshaping its values and institutions more rapidly than ever before. Education, global awareness, and the spread of human rights norms are cited as examples of progress that, if sustained, may reduce the likelihood of recurring catastrophes. Yet others caution that cultural evolution is itself cyclical, subject to waves of progress and regression, as rising tolerance is often followed by backlash. The oscillation between liberalization and authoritarianism, openness and closure, suggests that even cultural shifts are caught in the rhythm of repetition. Perhaps the most balanced view is to recognize that history will continue to repeat in some respects while diverging in others. The structural pressures of demography, inequality, and ecology guarantee that societies will face familiar challenges. But the forms of those challenges, and the responses available, are constantly changing. The wars of the future may not resemble those of the past, yet they will still express the same underlying dynamics of competition and fear. The crises of the 21st century may not be identical to those of the 20th, yet they will still test societies in ways that echo earlier struggles. Whether humanity ultimately breaks free of destructive cycles will depend less on eliminating repetition altogether and more on learning to navigate it more wisely, using foresight, cooperation, and restraint to turn recurrence into resilience rather than ruin. In the end, the question of why history repeats itself is inseparable from the larger inquiry into the nature of humanity. Every recurrence of war, revolution, crisis, or collapse acts as a mirror, reflecting back to us the constants of human psychology, biology, and social organization. However unique the surface details of each event may appear, beneath them lie patterns that reveal the underlying fabric of our existence. To study these repetitions is not simply to collect stories of the past but to confront the enduring realities of who we are as a species. The repetition of history is not an accident of poor memory or insufficient progress, it is a consequence of the conditions under which human beings live and act. The limits of cognition, the drive for power, the competition for resources, and the fragile balance of social systems ensure that the same types of crises resurface across generations. This perspective carries with it a sobering lesson but also a possibility for hope. If history is indeed a mirror of human nature, then repetition is unavoidable, yet it can be understood. To deny repetition is to deny the structures that shape human existence. To recognize it is to begin the work of learning. History's value lies precisely in this, that through the rhythm of recurrence, we can identify the forces that drive societies toward prosperity or destruction. Repetition ceases to be merely a trap when it becomes a teacher. Each crisis revisits familiar ground, but it also presents a new opportunity to interpret and act differently. Human beings may not be able to abolish cycles, but they can decide how to respond to them, whether with blindness and arrogance or with awareness and humility. Philosophically, repetition underscores the paradox of freedom within constraint. History reveals that individuals and societies do not act in a vacuum of infinite possibilities. Rather, they navigate within structures that nudge outcomes toward familiar forms. The rise and fall of empires, the oscillation between inequality and revolt, the tension between innovation and disruption, these are not accidents but regularities that suggest limits on human freedom. Yet within these limits, choice remains. A ship cannot change the tides or the winds, but it can steer its course, avoid reefs, and use the forces around it to reach safer shores. Likewise, understanding historical cycles may not allow humanity to escape repetition altogether, but it can provide guidance in steering through it more wisely. The central philosophical takeaway is that cycles are not merely destructive but can also serve as a form of collective learning. In each wave of crisis, something survives: knowledge, institutions, or cultural memory that equips the next generation to act with greater foresight. The Enlightenment arose in part as a response to the religious wars of Europe. The United Nations was born from the devastation of 2 world wars. Ecological consciousness has emerged in reaction to environmental degradation. These examples show that cycles are not closed loops but spirals, in which repetition contains the potential for progress. What appears as eternal recurrence may in fact be cumulative, carrying within it lessons that, if absorbed, move humanity toward a more mature form of existence. Still, the problem remains that societies often fail to learn from the past, falling into what might be called the tragedy of forgetfulness. Each generation tends to underestimate the relevance of earlier crises, convinced that its own innovations or circumstances make it exceptional. This arrogance ensures that mistakes are repeated, even when the evidence is available to avoid them. The task, then, is not only to recognize cycles but to institutionalize memory, to cultivate a culture in which historical awareness becomes an integral part of decision-making. Philosophy, education, and science all play roles in this project, translating the lessons of repetition into frameworks that future generations cannot easily discard. The ultimate question is whether understanding cycles can truly help humanity avoid mistakes. Here, caution is necessary. Knowledge does not automatically produce wisdom, and awareness of patterns does not guarantee action. Political and economic interests may override foresight, and human beings may persist in destructive behaviors despite understanding their consequences. Yet to dismiss the value of understanding would be equally unwise. Even if recognition of cycles cannot abolish repetition, it can reduce its destructiveness. A society that knows inequality breeds instability can take measures to soften its extremes. A civilization aware of ecological collapse can attempt to preserve resources. A polity conscious of the dangers of unchecked power can strengthen institutions of accountability. The cycles may continue, but their impacts can be managed, and the worst outcomes may be averted. In this sense, history does not condemn humanity to fatalism but calls it to responsibility. To study repetition is not to accept inevitability but to equip ourselves with the tools to navigate it. The very act of identifying patterns gives us a measure of control, however limited. Repetition, when recognized, becomes less a curse and more a challenge. Can we respond differently this time? Can we act with more wisdom than those before us? The answer is never certain, but the possibility exists, and that possibility is itself a reason to pursue historical understanding with seriousness. Thus, the philosophical lesson of historical repetition is twofold. First, it reveals the continuity of human nature and the structures that shape our lives, reminding us of the limits within which we act. Second, it offers the chance to transform recurrence from blind fate into conscious reflection, turning cycles into opportunities for growth. We may never escape repetition entirely, but we can aspire to use it, to learn from it, and to bend its rhythm toward resilience rather than ruin. History, then, is not only a record of what has been but a mirror held up to what we are, and a guide to what we might yet become if we choose to learn from its recurring patterns.